All right, so we're shifting gears a little bit here today, and I'm going to do a how-to video. So I've been working with epoxy resin for about a year and a half now, so I'm far from an expert, right, on the subject. But I do know enough now where I can confidently do a video and kind of go over the essentials, the basics, materials, how-tos, things like that, for any beginners that are out there that want to delve into the world of epoxy resin, making things with epoxy resin, so forth. So this video will be geared directly at epoxy resin specifically. I won't really be talking about UV resin or polyurethane resin. I've never actually worked with polyurethane resin. I have worked with UV resin. I may do a video in the future on that. That's a lot more simple. But this is kind of, I wanted to do a somewhat comprehensive video on the basics and essentials of working with epoxy resin. So I guess the first place to start would be the materials you'll need. Now, obviously, the first material you're going to need is epoxy resin. And typically, epoxy resin is going to come in two parts, part A and part B. And you'll mix those two together according to a certain ratio. Sometimes it's 1-to-1, sometimes it's 2-to-1, I think sometimes even 3-to-1 ratios. But essentially, it's going to come in two parts. So I'm going to be going over how to mix the resin, again, the materials you'll need, so forth. So obviously the first material you'll need is epoxy resin. The second material, which is just as important, is PPE, personal protective equipment. Resin is very toxic. Don't let anybody fool you otherwise. It's very toxic. So obviously the first thing you're going to want is hand protection, skin protection. Any area of your body that could potentially come in physical contact with the resin before it's cured, you're going to want to protect that. So obviously gloves are a must because it can be very messy and you're going to need protection, skin protection, because it will irritate your skin if you have prolonged contact. So right here I have some vinyl gloves. Typically I opt for nitrile gloves because they're a little more stretchy. Vinyl gloves don't really have a lot of give. I just bought the vinyl gloves because they were the cheapest option at the time. I prefer the nitrile gloves because they've got more give, and as a rather tall person, I have pretty big hands, so it's really really rough to squeeze into these vinyl gloves because they don't have a lot of give and they will rip. And I do often rip many of these. I've probably ripped half the ones I've tried to use. I really need to get some nitrile gloves in here. So yeah, you can use latex too. A lot of people are allergic to latex. But the thing I don't really like about latex is oftentimes they come powdered. They've got powder on them, and that's just extra residue that may it may get into the resin. It's probably not going to hurt the resin, but I would just rather not have that. The next bit of protection you need, and this is very vital, and a lot of people overlook this, a lot of people dismiss this, which is a big mistake, is lung protection. So let's put it this way. A dust mask or a COVID mask is not going to cut it. That's not going to do anything for you. Because with resin, you're dealing with VOCs, which are volatile organic compounds. And to put it bluntly, if you breathe that in, it will fuck your lungs up pretty bad. So when I first started epoxy resin, I didn't think I needed anything like this. Even though I saw videos of people using it, I'm like, well, I must have some special kind of resin because this resin doesn't really seem to have fumes. It don't stink up the room. If I get really close to it, I can kind of smell it, and it smells weird, but it doesn't seem like it has any fumes. How can it hurt me? Well, after a while of working unprotected with resin, I did start to have some lung gunk and inflammation. And, it turns out people are right when they say you really need to protect your lungs with this stuff. So you need to find something like this, something that's good and airtight. And you want to specifically find something with filters for VOCs. If it's just a dust mask, it's not going to do you any good. You might as well not even wear a mask at that point. You need something to protect your lungs from the VOCs. And something like this, I got this on Amazon for about 20 bucks. Came with the whole setup, came with some extra filters. It's rated for VOCs. And I've never had any lung issues after starting to use this. So you need that. Now, some people will say you need eye protection. I haven't ran into any situations working with resin where I needed eye protection. I'm not getting that close to the resin. I'm not sticking my face in there. I'm not, and you don't want to mix it up vigorously anyway. So I'm not really sure why a lot of people recommend eye protection. Maybe it's just an extra precaution. However, there was one instance, not while working with resin, but when I first bought this resin, when you took the cap off, there was a little seal that you pop off. And sure enough, when I popped it off, some of the part A or part B, whichever one it was, actually kind of splashed up. And literally, luckily, my reflexes were fast and I closed my eyes real quick. A bit of the part A or B or whatever splashed up and hit me right on the eyelid. If that would have went in my eye, oh my God, I would have been in a world of hurt. So glad that didn't happen. So I would recommend that if you've got some resin like this that comes with a pop-off seal, maybe you want to wear some glasses, some safety glasses, or look away when you pop it open, because that would have been bad if that got into my eyeball. So the next material you'll need is really, in general, silicone. Silicone it goes hand in hand with resin. Not just the molds, but mixing cups and work surfaces. So with a mixing cup, obviously, again, part A and part B are going to need to be mixed. And you're going to need some way of gauging how much of part A and part B you have. Some resins work on a weight ratio scale. So in that case, you would need a scale, like a small postal scale or whatever. I typically use volume-based epoxy resin. And so for that, I have these little measuring cups, and they're silicone. So that way, when the little bit of resin that may be left in there dries up, or rather cures, you can just pop it right out. It comes right off. Resin will not stick to silicone, and that's why most of your molds for resin are silicone. Now, the next bit of silicone that's pretty invaluable is these little silicone mats. For the same reason, you want to put this on your work surface, so when you spill resin, which you will, that way it doesn't ruin your table, your work surface, whatever. You can find these in a lot of places. This right here, I don't use for epoxy resin per se, because it's pretty small. I have some bigger ones. You can get them on Amazon. I got this at the Dollar Tree. It's supposed to be just like a hot glue gun thing, and that's kind of what I use it for. Or you can go somewhere like Hobby Lobby, go to the baking section, I have a much larger one here that I'm not going to pull up because I got a bunch of stuff on it. But it's a big old pink silicone mat that's intended for baking, but you can use it for epoxy resin, obviously. And that covers up most of my workspace. Also, a lot of times I'll use the silicone mat in conjunction with some parchment paper or sometimes wax paper, just kind of add a extra level of protection. And then that way, a lot of times I don't even got to wait for the resin to cure up on the silicone to peel it off. It's just perfectly fine. Just an extra layer of protection. Also, you could just, if you're on a budget, you could just go to the dollar store and get some wax paper or parchment paper if you're starting out, and just not even worry about getting a silicone mat. They're not really that expensive, but I mean, maybe you're on an extreme budget and maybe you're just starting out and you're not sure if you want to really seriously invest a lot of time and money into epoxy resin. You can use parchment paper or wax paper to protect your surface. So the next material that I find very invaluable in working with resin is alcohol, rubbing alcohol. Now you want to go for the highest percentage alcohol you can. As a matter of fact, if you're going to be using it in the resin itself, you want at least 70% alcohol. Because the other bit, like if you use 50% alcohol, the other 50% of that is water, which does not mix well with resin. We'll get into that later. So I usually opt for at least 91%. If you can get your hands on 99% alcohol, that's even better. So I use 91% alcohol, and I keep it in a spray bottle, which is aptly labeled Alky. I keep it in a spray bottle because sometimes I'll use it to pop bubbles, which I will discuss later in the video, how you can do that. You can even use it to kind of thin your resin out a little bit when you're mixing it, so you can avoid some bubbles altogether. Or also, a lot of times, instead of letting my excess resin that's in here, instead of letting that cure up, taking all that time to cure up and then peel it out, a lot of times I'll hit this bad boy with some alcohol real good and take a paper towel and wipe it out real good, and it's good to go. It's immediately ready for use again, because the alcohol really thins out the resin, helps you be able to clean it out a lot better. So the next thing you're going to want, now it's not vital, but it's heavily recommended, and that would be a heat source of some sort to help you pop bubbles when working with resin. When you finally get everything poured, you're going to have bubbles in pretty much any resin, and so you want to try and avoid that as much. So to pop surface bubbles, you can use a torch, you can use a lighter, or you can use a heat gun. I use all three in various applications. Now, with the torch, the big downside is you don't want to use it in a silicone mold, with a silicone mold, because you will scorch your silicone and you'll ruin your mold if you get that much heat too close. I mean, this torch goes up to, I think, 1300 degrees, allegedly. You know, that's what the label said. So if you're working with a silicone mold and you want to pop bubbles with, you know, heat, you can opt for this. This can burn your silicone mold, but you're going to have to really leave the heat on there to do any significant damage to your mold. Though oftentimes, unless I've got some serious bubbles, I'll use a heat gun. The downside to the heat gun is it's not as effective as the torch. This torch will blast bubbles out probably up to a millimeter deep under the surface. Whereas this is really, a heat gun's really only going to take care of your very top surface bubbles. But what it also does is it kind of temporarily, it'll thin your resin out so those bubbles can rise up. If you heat it up real good, those bubbles will rise up a little better, and you can kind of keep popping them. But also, the heat in general will kind of kick off the curing process a little quicker for your resin. Now, there are some safety issues with using an open flame, which I will get into in the next portion of this. But moving along to the next thing that you're going to need is pretty basic. You're going to need a level surface to work on. So you're going to want a level to make sure your surface is level. And basically the reason for this is resin typically is self-leveling. So if you have your mold on a real wonky kind of unlevel surface, say it's like that, maybe not that extreme, that's pretty extreme. You're going to have, the resin's going to be deeper in this lower part, and there may hardly be any at all in this part up here. So you want a level surface because it is going to want to level itself out before it starts curing, because it flows, it's a liquid. So definitely need a level surface. And they even make little platform things with screws on the bottom that'll kind of level your surface. Now my workstation is, and I check it frequently just in case, but my big desk here, I've leveled the whole desk itself. So I've got nothing to worry about there. I can do my resin there, I can do my acrylic pours there. It's not a problem. I do, again, periodically check it because maybe it could settle or something, I don't know. It never really goes out of level, but better safe than sorry. So, level surface. The next thing, and this one's not really a must either, but it's very useful, is some kind of pick or skewer. Now these right here are just barbecue skewer things for like shish kebabs and stuff like that. They're pretty cheap. You can get a big pack of them for $1. Now they normally come really long. So what I do, so it's a little more easy to manage, is I just take a bundle of them and I cut it down to size. And so what's cool about that is, what that is it gives me two variations. So I've got the one with the pointy end, and I've got one with two blunt ends, because there's several applications you might want to use that for too. But mainly what this is good for is it facilitates popping bubbles you can kind of delve down in there into the resin and kind of gently pull the bubbles to the surface so you can hit them with the torch or lighter or whatever. And also it's really good for if you got little bits of lint or a hair or some foreign object that has fallen into your resin and you need to get it out before it sets up. These are great. You just get it in there and you can scoop the little bit of whatever out of there. So those are great to have. You could use a toothpick. Anything kind of pointy or whatever like that. Any kind of fine point material, you can really get in there and delicately scoop it out without disturbing too much resin. Because if you disturb a bunch of resin, like if you use a popsicle stick to do that, you're going to just create more bubbles because you're disturbing the resin and whipping air into it, causing more bubbles. So the next thing is pretty much, I would say it's an essential. That would be paper towels, obviously, because you're going to need cleanup. Again, I tend to immediately clean off my mixing cups and this, which I'll get into later. This is basically just a stirring stick, and it's coated in silicone. So again, the same thing. You could let the resin cure and just peel it off. But again, I usually opt to spritz it with alcohol and clean it up right away. That way, if I need to do more resin pouring, I can just immediately reuse this, even though I do have several, as well as with the measuring cups. But yeah, paper towels, kind of an absolute must for cleanup. Now, another material you'll really want for cleanup is baby wipes. Now, the reason you want baby wipes is, well, quite frankly, in the middle of your project, you might have to take a poop. And you don't want to come back to your project all messy and uncomfortable after you take a poop, so you're going to want to really clean up good. I'm just kidding. That's not what... I mean, you could use this for that, but that's... what these are great for is cleaning your molds. Because again, even though once this cures up, once the resin cures up on the silicone, you can pop it off. But a lot of times you'll get these little tiny bits and pieces stuck to there, and you just want a little bit of extra help. You want a little bit of extra help, so you just go in with a baby wipe. Great for silicone molds too, because a lot of times after you do a project, you'll have some little bits and pieces maybe stuck to your mold. And you want to clean that up because you don't want that to be embedded in your next project. So, baby wipes.